Okay, let's do this. So today is November 22nd, right? And as most Americans know, that would mean today is the anniversary of the assassination of JFK. So I do want to talk a little bit about that today. Now, interestingly enough, on that same day, the exact same day, November 22nd, 1963, there were a few other significant individuals who also died. One of those would be C.S. Lewis, and the other would be Aldous Huxley, interestingly enough. But anyway, we're not going to talk about those two individuals today. We are going to talk about the JFK assassination. I would say that today's video is to some degree a continuation of a video that I did a while back called A Broader Look: Coups and the Deep State. So I will link that video down below if you've not checked that video out. I would encourage you to go check it out because I go into some context that I'm not necessarily going to cover in this video. So we are going to talk a little bit about, this term, the deep state, but and deep events. But I'm not going to go into as much detail about that specific stuff as broadly as I did in that video. So the JFK assassination. Now, this is an event that clearly precedes my time. I'm not that old, but it's my understanding that people who are old enough to remember that event can tell you where they were when they learned that JFK had been killed, right? Much like people my age can tell you where we were when 9/11 happened or when we first learned about the 9/11 attack, etc. You know, and I know if you go and look at some polls, and I'm not telling you how accurate these polls are, I don't know, but I do know that if you go look at several polls, you'll see these figures somewhere between about 60 or 65%, which would be the percentage of Americans that disbelieve some aspect of the official narrative on the JFK assassination. Okay. So according to those polls, and again, my assumption is they're probably low, but even if they're not, it still means that nearly two-thirds of Americans don't buy in whole or in part the story that we have been told about the JFK assassination. Now, me saying that is not even controversial because so many people question what happened on that date and who was involved, right? And to date, there has been no accountability. And many Americans, in as much as they think about the Warren Commission or know what the Warren Commission is, would consider it a sham. Now, let's just talk. We're not going to go into a lot of detail about this, but if you think about what happened in Kennedy's presidency leading up to the moment in which he is killed. Now, I do know that there are people, let me just insert this for a moment. I do know that there are people out there that think that the JFK assassination was staged, that he did not actually die that day. I'm not necessarily one of those individuals. I do think that he did die that day. Um, but if you're one of those individuals who thinks that maybe that was staged to some degree, um, cool. But it would still be an op. It's still an op. And I don't even necessarily think that it would be that far fetched that they would stage it. I just don't think that that's what happened. But anyway, but either way, again, it would have been a planned op by the deep state. So what happened in Kennedy's presidency up to this event? Because there was a lot going on. For a guy who was in office for only a couple of years, what, less than 3 years? Um, what what had taken place? Well, if you're familiar with the Bay of Pigs invasion, that happened early on in the spring of 1961. So very shortly after he had been inaugurated, there had been this operation for an invasion into Cuba that had been conceptualized, planned, etc., before he ever came into office. So he kind of inherited this. He was briefed up on it. Anyway, yeah, he authorizes it. The plan is a complete failure. I don't want to necessarily start talking about the Bay of Pigs here. So you can go look that up on your own, but just understand that the Bay of Pigs had happened. It was a total fiasco. And it was one of the first significant things that happened during his time in office. And then what happens? So a year later, you get Operation Northwoods, which does not actually happen, but it consists of this plan that is briefed to Kennedy, in which the military, to include the senior most military officers, had this plan devised to basically conduct things that would even include false flag operations targeting American citizens, which then could be blamed on Cuba to serve as a pretext for, you know, an invasion into Cuba. So that was briefed to Kennedy. He rejected the plan, but that was briefed to Kennedy in early 1962. In late 1962, you get the Cuban Missile Crisis. So all of this is happening. Oh, by the way, a lot of this stuff is centered around Cuba, but all of that stuff is kind of happening in the first couple of years of his administration. Meanwhile, and of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis also has a lot to do with the Soviet Union. There are these different factions in Washington that have these various ideas of how to deal with the Soviet Union, right? And then also there's Vietnam in the background. Now we tend to think of actually going into Vietnam a little bit later, but again, there are people who say, well, one of the reasons that Kennedy had to be removed is so that we could actually do a full-blown invasion into Vietnam. We had to remove Kennedy. There are other people that say, hey, Kennedy wasn't moving in the right direction that we needed him to move in terms of aggression towards the Soviet Union. So, we had to remove him. There are others that talk about, the banking elites wanting Kennedy gone. There are some who talk about the UFO file and needing Kennedy to be gone. So regardless of what it is, we also know that Kennedy had been very pissed off with the CIA, largely after what happened with the Bay of Pigs. And, he did make this comment where he supposedly said that he was going to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces. Many of you are aware that he made that comment. Well, what else? So there was a famous speech where he also said, many of you probably also heard this quotation from him, but he had a speech where he said that the very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. So what exactly is going on with JFK? Is he an opponent to the deep state? Because there are people out there that say, no, he was deeply embedded with this, whatever. I don't pretend to necessarily know. So in today's video, I do want to talk through a couple of things, but I'm not going to give you some grand assessment as to exactly what I think happened with the JFK assassination, because I'll be the first to tell you that I don't know. I think it's a horrible tragedy. It's a huge stain on the history of this country, and it does represent a massive victory for the deep state, right? But I'm not going to tell you that I know exactly what happened. And I have researched it because I do find it interesting in kind of a tragic way, but it is something that we should try to seek to understand. And, there's this weird element with this, right? Because I said before that nearly 2/3 of Americans reject to some degree the official story. So that there's kind of this interesting phenomenon there, right? Where we as a nation somehow collectively accept or tolerate a narrative that individually many of us reject. So I find that fascinating, but fascinating in a tragic way. So as a country, as a collective body of citizens, we accept as part of our historical record, and history has, been built on this, something that individually most of us know is a pack of lies, right? And I think that's an indictment of our society, that collectively we will adhere to lies and kind of build the historical edifice on a foundation of lies. And you have to ask yourself, how long can we sustain that? How long can a society sustain itself when it is knowingly built on lies, meaning that many of its citizens know that a lot of the mythology of the country is untrue, you know? So, anyway, all right, let's talk about the idea of coups very quickly. And again, if you want to learn more about this, go watch that other video. You can get more of my thoughts on this. So, a lot of people talk about what's happening in our own country right now, and I have said before that I don't necessarily think what's happening right now is a coup per se, right? Um, it's more that we're in part of a larger ongoing coup. Now there's an issue with that because the word coup, coup d'etat, right? I mean, the word literally means like strike or blow. So it does imply something sudden. But in my mind, it's more like, let's not necessarily attach ourselves to this overly rigid idea of like a sudden coup. Okay. There doesn't have to be some sort of sudden, immediate, often violent overthrow of a president or of a leader or an ouster of a political party that will then be replaced by another. Okay. In a sudden movement. That doesn't necessarily have to happen. What we can have is we can have an ongoing transfer of power that happens, through an arc of time, right? But then along that arc, there can be these certain punctuated moments where there are these sudden, discrete events. Okay. And so what happens, I'm going to read something that I wrote here. And I probably read it in the other video, but I'm just going to read it here. So what's happening right now isn't a coup per se. It's one event within a larger coup. We must understand this or we'll underestimate the problem. Most people have an overly rigid view of what a coup is. It doesn't have to be a sudden, often violent overthrow or ouster of one group by another to control a government. A coup can also be executed over time. It may consist of a gradual transitional arc, at times punctuated by certain discrete events that move the ongoing coup into further stages of completion. This arc ends with the government in different hands, just as occurs with a more standard coup. 9/11 was clearly necessary to prep the stage for the COVID op. Before that, the JFK assassination was monumental in moving the coup along. And the coup arc was already in motion well before JFK, the creation of the Fed being one example. There are plenty more examples. I only mention a few here. Okay, so what's the point? Over this arc of history, you have these single discrete events, which kind of move the transfer of power into successive phases, right? So something occurs here, and then on down the road, there's a new event, and then things kind of move into a subsequent phase, right? And in the end, there will be a completed transfer of power, but it doesn't all happen at one time in one movement. Okay. So that said, it doesn't mean that there aren't these massive discrete moments in which we kind of transition into another phase of this ongoing, gradual, incrementalist transfer of power. And I think most of us would agree that the deep state is behind that. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time kind of explaining what the deep state is or whatever, because I did that in that other video. But what I am going to do is I am going to read a little bit about it as it pertains to this event, the JFK assassination. So we've talked about Peter Dale Scott before because he's not the one who coined the term the deep state. That comes from Turkey. We talked about that in the other video. But he is the one who popularizes it in kind of the Western lexicon or in the English language. And therefore, that's how the term has become known to Americans or to Westerners. So he's talked about the JFK assassination in multiple books. Okay, we're going to look at this one today. Okay, it's called Dallas 63, the first deep state revolt against the White House. So again, Peter Dale Scott, Dallas 63, the first deep state revolt against the White House. Now, is the first? I mean, I guess we could probably quibble about that, but it was definitely a monumental one for sure. Okay. All right, let's talk about I'm just going to start reading here. So, two governments. All right, so here Peter Dale Scott is he is going to quote two journalists named Dana Priest and William Arkin. And so he says these two journalists, he's going to talk about what they have called two governments. The one its citizens were familiar with, operated more or less in the open. The other, a parallel top secret government whose parts had mushroomed in less than a decade into a gigantic, sprawling universe of its own, visible to only a carefully vetted cadre, and its entirety visible only to God. Okay, so he cites these two journalists who are talking about, hey, there are two governments. There's one is kind of the public-facing government, the one that everybody acknowledges that was set up by the Constitution, is governed by the law, right? And then there is this other government that is extremely difficult to see, and the entire architecture of is visible only to God, according to these journalists that Scott is going to cite here. He goes on. This is so he just cited me reading that was him citing them. Now Peter Dale Scott goes on. The latter has become so powerful that some of us have come to call it the deep state. He goes on. Mike Lofgren has described the visible public state as the tip of the iceberg and the covert deep state as the subsurface part of the iceberg. All right. So you got, the top of the iceberg is the part of the government that we all kind of acknowledge, the lawful part of the government. According to this guy, Mike Lofgren, the much larger, more substantial hidden part of the iceberg is the deep state. Now, Peter Dale Scott, he's going to say, hey, we all acknowledge that metaphor, but not so fast. So he says, this metaphor, though spatially useful, misses an important difference between the two levels. The public state that we see is a defined structure. The deep state, in contrast, passes through covert agencies into an undefined system, as difficult to define, but also as real and powerful as a weather system. Okay, so spatially, maybe it works. You got like the small part of the iceberg that is visible, and then you got this, enormous part of the iceberg that's beneath the surface of the water that is much, much, much larger. And in maybe that regard, maybe the metaphor applies. But he says, even that hidden part of the iceberg is defined, whereas the deep state is not. It's too amorphous, right? He goes on. More specifically, it interacts not only with the public state, but also with higher sources of its power, most significantly with the financial institutions of Wall Street. Because of this interaction, I find myself sometimes using deep state in an inclusive sense to refer to all those forces outside the public state with the power to influence its policies, and more often using deep state in a restrictive sense, meaning those active covert agencies in and around Washington that sometimes take guidance in their policies, not from the White House, but from the deep state as a whole. This ambiguity in language may sometimes be confusing, but represents the ambiguity and diffuseness of deep power itself. All right, so the deep state, hard to define, quite nebulous in its structure because it's not overly structured. And so Peter Dale Scott himself, the guy who has popularized the term, in the way that we have become familiar with it, though I think that meaning has become twisted in ways that he did not intend. But he says, hey, I myself, the guy who uses this term, I sometimes use it in two different ways. One, in a more inclusive sense, to represent all these forces outside the public state. and one in a more restrictive sense where I'm kind of talking about stuff in and around Washington. Okay. Because, of course, you can take the deep state to mean all these corporate interests. And I mean, you could even, some people would expand it to even mean, like secret societies and, even stuff like that. I don't know that Peter Dale Scott would say that, but there are people who have expanded upon his term. Okay, he goes on. This is a book about the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, who, after the brush with the nuclear war in the Cuban Missile Crisis, took initial steps to reduce the role of hegemonic violence in American foreign policy. But on another level, this is also a book tracing how the forces of hegemonic violence in America came to be prevalent over the once predominant forces in America calling for containment, parity, and coexistence. Obviously, we're talking about, with the Soviet Union, in the Cold War. It is a central proposition of this book that the road to U.S. It is a central proposition of this book that the road to U.S. hegemony must be understood as in part a consequence of a series of structural deep events. And this series began with the assassination in 1963 of a president who was moving to change U.S. policies with respect to Cuba, Vietnam, and above all, the Soviet Union. Okay, so the road to U.S. hegemony must be understood as in part a consequence of a series of structural deep events. So again, he doesn't just use the term deep state, but also deep events, deep politics, etc. By structural deep events, I mean events that are never fully understood. This is important. Arise out of ongoing covert processes, have political consequences that enlarge covert government, and are subsequently covered up by demonstrable omissions and falsifications in historic records. Here, the assassination in Dallas can be compared to later structural deep events, notably Watergate and 9/11. So structural deep events, all right, I mean events that are never fully understood, arise out of ongoing covert processes, have political consequences, are subsequently covered up. All right, he goes on to say, I cannot say enough, or I cannot say often enough, that I am not attributing all these deep events to any single agency or secret team. All right, and he does reiterate that. So he's not saying, hey, the deep state consists of like this body right here, and all these deep events are done by just this particular body of people. Okay. And you can tell that he knows that that's probably a common interpretation that people may attribute to him, because he clearly wants to debunk that thought. I cannot say often enough that I am not attributing all these deep events to any single agency or secret team. Nor is the purpose of this book to identify the president's killers. Okay. So, and then, he goes on to say here, I will argue that these structural deep events, even though not the work of a single mastermind or secret team, were nevertheless all interconnected, arising from a common milieu and with certain recurring characteristics. So that's kind of his, that's from the introduction of the book. And then, obviously he gets into his argumentation for what he's going to talk about here. But we see in plenty of his books what he means by deep state, deep events, deep politics, etc. But I wanted to read that to at least get some of his thoughts about how that applies to the JFK assassination. All right, we're going to look at one more book, because I think most of us would agree that, yeah, the JFK assassination was done by the deep state. Now, who is the deep state? Now, again, I don't want to rehash what I said in the other videos. So again, if you have not watched that, please go watch it. But I will say two things. So the term deep state comes from Turkey. All right. You can look that up, or you can go listen to where I explained that in the other video. Um, Professor Peter Dale Scott is the one who kind of introduces it into our lexicon. That's where we kind of get the term from. And I would say the term precedes, Trump's first campaign, but it was probably during Trump's first campaign that term became introduced in such a way that it is now recognized. It's now a household term. If I say the deep state to anybody, they're probably gonna know generally what I mean, though I do think that there are some ways in which that term has been divorced from its intended meaning. Okay. And I think there are two ways in which it has come to be interpreted that are not what the term originally meant and not what Peter Dale Scott intends for it to mean either. And one of those is it came to mean like Democrats. Okay. So the deep state is not synonymous with Democrats. That's not what the deep state is. If it could be largely summed up as pertaining to one of the two major political parties, then it wouldn't be a deep state. Okay. Now that doesn't mean that there's not some, machinery behind each of the two political parties. Yeah, there is, right? But it's not the deep state. Okay. The deep state very much controls both political parties. And if you're a Republican, yeah, that includes your party too. I'm sorry. I know that's shocking. So no, the deep state does not just mean Democrats. It also doesn't just mean Republicans. Okay. The other is the deep state does not, it's not just another term for unelected bureaucrats. Okay. Now, can unelected bureaucrats be part of the deep state? Sure. But that's not, we're not just talking about people who have been in Washington for a long time. Okay. We're not just talking about people who cut corners at their jobs. Okay. I'm not saying that that's good or legitimate or people should be doing that, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about something that is far more sinister and far larger, and in some ways operates totally outside the law and has built itself up in ways that are almost impenetrable by the law. Maybe not totally, but in many ways. The law, it's kind of outside where the law doesn't seem to touch it. And we all know of cases where things happen and nobody's held accountable, at least legally accountable. And one of those cases, one of the best ones in U.S. history, or when I say one of the best ones, like one of the clearest examples, is the JFK assassination. That we're talking about. So let's look at this book. Okay, so this book is called LBJ and the Conspiracy to Kill Kennedy. The subtitle is A Coalescence of Interests, and it's by Joseph P. Farrell, who I've talked about before on here. I do like his books. He's not for everybody. I mean, he goes through a lot of stuff and pulls a lot of threads together and will try to pull a lot of threads and then weave something together that makes sense, but he'll do it in ways that that may he will speculate. Now, I do think he's pretty honest about when he's speculating. He's pretty honest about, hey, this is a fact and this is a fact, and here I'm conjecturing a bit. I mean, he's pretty good at that. But he will pull a lot of threads that other researchers don't necessarily pull on. Some people like that, some people don't. And he will speculate about a lot of stuff where normal mainstream researchers are just not going to go. Okay, so I like this book. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But what we're going to talk about today, though, is a chapter that he calls The Alchemy of the Assassination. So we're talking about the JFK assassination. We just talked about what a deep event is, done by the deep state. But now we're going to talk about, is there a potential ritualistic aspect to the JFK assassination? Now, I've talked about this a lot. I come from the military. I still use a lot of military jargon when I talk. I try not to use too much. I don't want people to not know what I'm talking about, but I try to frame things from a military perspective because I do believe that we're in a war. Okay, so if you think about what a military operation is, and then understand that those who are targeting us, many of them operate on occult principles. So what we might call a military operation to them is a ritual. It's a type of dark occult ritual. Okay, so this chapter is called The Alchemy of the Assassination, Ritual Magic, and Masonic Symbolism of the Coup d'etat. And I will tell you now, so what I like about this book is, so he relies on a couple of other authors who also have written books about JFK, and some of those books I really like. I mean, there is the book by Fletcher Prouty that is called, I think it's just called JFK. I can't remember the subtitle. But he does cite that book in here. He cites, I think he cites the book by Jim Mars, which I believe is called Crossfire. I've got it over here somewhere. And right now we're going to read where he cites some of the work by Michael A. Hoffman, who I've talked about before and who I've written about. And he will cite the book, which is, I've got actually right here next to me. Secret Societies and Psychological Operations. Okay. Or Psychological Warfare. Yeah. All right. So he starts with an epigraph by James Shelby Downard and Michael A. Hoffman. And it says, the ultimate purpose of that assassination was not political or economic, but sorcerous. Okay. Ritual magic seems the least likely motivation for the assassination of President Kennedy. Yet, in the deepest sense, it holds the key to it all, and in so doing, points a clear finger to the deep politics and deepest players in the whole alchemical psychodrama played out with all the deliberate exactitude of an occult ritual. Now, I talk about this a lot, not because I'm some expert in the occult. I don't dig into that stuff too deeply because I don't really want to, but I do believe that this stuff is important to understand. I do believe that the people that are waging war on humanity are exceptionally evil people, and they do operate in this fashion, and they do it for the most sinister purposes. All right, so what does he say? Okay, so he refers to this as an alchemical psychodrama, the deliberate exactitude of an occult ritual in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963, for that is exactly what it was, a ritual of sacrifice, an alchemical working, the heartbeat of black magic at the center of the century's most daring coup d'etat. To describe the assassination as an alchemical act is not as odd as it might at first seem. For one of the goals of esoteric alchemy is the transformation of mankind himself. That is, to create, via a magical operation, a transformation of consciousness in a group of individuals, in this case, the psyche of the American people and culture themselves. And then he goes on to say, but why do we call it a coup d'etat? Does the assassination bear the actual signatures of a coup d'etat? How does the ritual magic, the alchemical element, fit in, meaning, fit into this being a coup? Michael A. Hoffman II is one of the few researchers to have delved into the ritual magic aspects of modern social engineering in general, and the Kennedy assassination in particular, in a seminal little book entitled Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare, which I've got right there. And it is a good book. And he does talk about this in it. And I could just read it from there. But I like a lot of Farrell's commentary on what Hoffman says, which is why I'm reading it from here. Okay, so he refers to some other ritual aspects that were happening and kind of these very occult ideas. So Farrell says there are three essential alchemical workings, each of which is also designed to bring about a transformation of consciousness in addition to the goal of each working. And then he mentions one of these as being the killing or sacrifice of the king. Okay, so the killing of the king ritual. These workings are designed, says Hoffman, with the goal of planting certain memes into the social consciousness. Now, what do we mean by a meme, right? No, this is not what you see on whatever, your Twitter account. Okay, by a meme, I mean, it is, but like what we mean here is a meme is like a cultural unit of information, right? So therefore, it could be an idea or something that is propagated, widely through, society, right? So it's a cultural unit of information. So in this case of the Kennedy assassination, the sacrifice of the king or the killing of the king, the memes to be implanted were clear. Okay, so there's this idea of inevitablism, all right, or the idea that this is all inevitable. Okay, it is useless to resist control, central establishment control. The Kennedy assassination was, in other words, one of the magical workings in modern times designed to implant these memes. Okay. So, what of Hoffman's assertion that this is all in aid of a covert and deep agenda? And a magical one. One that, I mean, it says here to reinvoke the presence of the old gods, right? So I'm going to keep reading here. The assassination of President Kennedy, to put it succinctly, was all done in aid of a deeply occult agenda and a very old one. And then he quotes him directly. So he quotes Hoffman directly. What we observe in the population today are three destructive symptoms of persons whose minds are controlled by alien forces. Now, I don't think he means like alien, like extraterrestrials, just like outside forces. One, loss of memory. Two, loss of will. Three, loss of interest in events vital to one's own health and survival. Crucial to the magical working is the fact that it must be, as a matter of occult principle, clearly communicated to the intended targets or victims, in this case, by the open parade of symbolism indicating the true significance of the act and its dark motivations and perpetrators, by a series of deliberate leaks. Okay, so that's Farrell talking. But what he is saying is, because I talk about this all the time about how those, we'll just call them the deep state, just in line with what Peter Dale Scott was saying, in the context of this event. They want us to know what they're doing, so they will tell us. Now, they will not always overtly tell us. They'll hint at it, or it will be in the symbolism or the imagery that is used, or they will subtly tell us about, what's going on. But they will tell us because they are engineering our consent, because then that makes the ritual that much stronger. So I'm going to read that again. Crucial to this magical working is the fact that it must be, as a matter of occult principle, clearly communicated to its intended targets or victims, in this case, by the open parade of symbolism indicating the true significance of the act and its dark motivations and perpetrators, by a series of deliberate leaks. So they're going to leak information because they want you to know what has been done and what the dark motivations were and who were the perpetrators. Now, they may not tell you by name who the perpetrators were, but they're going to tell you in general terms, right? So this alludes to the process wherein murderous deeds and hair-raising conspiracies involving wars, revolutions, every manner of horror show are first buried beneath a cloak of secrecy, and then, when finally accomplished and secured, slowly revealed to the unsuspecting populace who watch deep frozen as the hidden history is unveiled. In the circulation of manuscripts or whatever they use to disclose, the revelation of the method is accomplished. Okay, so what are we saying here? they're going to allude to these misdeeds or these murderous deeds, hair-raising conspiracies. They're going to allude to these by gradually disclosing information about what happened, what was done. The reason for this is because such revelations may only serve to strengthen the cryptocracy's mental hold. Now, the cryptocracy is the term that Hoffman uses to describe the deep state, though for him it'd be larger than just like the American deep state, but those that are kind of controlling these events, in the big picture. The purpose of these activities is to reinforce the notion that there is nothing we can do about it but accept it. Hoffman's meaning is clear. By parading their power in a clear act of ritual murder and then explaining that murder with an explanation that was self-evidently ridiculous and untrue and wrapping it in the purple of official sanction, the population was reduced to confusion. Okay. We shall see how this consent in the status quo and these states of minds in populations are crucial elements of the coup d'etat. All right, what are we talking about here? So this murder is done, whether it's the JFK assassination or something, some other horrific event. They explain it with a story that is ridiculous. And then you are left and you're confused because you're like, well, okay, but that story doesn't make sense. Like, that cannot be true. That story makes no sense. So then what do, right? And you're constantly asking yourself, well, is there anything that we can do in this society? Like, is our society just gone? Are we truly run? Is our society truly run by psychopaths? Is it really that bad? And there are people who are, kind of paralyzed by this confusion. So they consent to this status quo because they're paralyzed, All right, so now we go on. We're going to talk about some of the ritual symbolism of the assassination. So how does the assassination of President Kennedy fit into all of the deep politics of the occult? So let's consider the blatant fact, the obvious things to see how. America's first and only Roman Catholic president. Now, since this was written, I guess Biden was Catholic, right? America's first and only Roman Catholic president's motorcade takes him through Daley Plaza, a plaza dedicated to the memory of the first Masonic Grand Master of Texas. Thus is met in Daley Plaza an old animosity, that of the Roman Church and Freemasonry, that of a Catholic religion for the masses versus a Gnostic Hermetic sect preserving its secrets for the initiate of higher consciousness and degrees. Even in this, there is Masonic significance. For the builder of the Temple of Man in Masonic initiatory ritual, Hiram Abiff, is murdered by 3 treasonous servants. Kennedy in his limousine is riding like the king in the Masonic ritual into a trap. The trap itself has symbolic significance for the layout of the 3 streets converging in Daley Plaza when viewed from above form a trident, the symbol of Poseidon, the god of the sea, a symbolism full of Atlantean reference to the old gods and to their vanished civilization and all its technologies with their secret societies preserving their secrets. Okay, so if you look at an aerial photo of Daley Plaza, it looks like a trident, which is a significant symbol. And here we have what he's going to refer to as this darkly occult stage, So, and now we have the unsuspecting President Kennedy, who is basically riding in the motorcade into a trap that is replete with Masonic symbolism. And then he shows a photo here. I didn't remember this, but of 3 guys that were supposedly arrested and then they were released. Nobody knows their names. and they were referred to as the Three Tramps. And so he is making the association between these three guys and this like photo of them, having been arrested, but they get released. Nobody knows their names, but he is referring to them as they are playing the role of these three guys that are part of this initiatory ritual in Freemasonry. Where in the ritual they are known as Jubello, Jubella, and Jubellum. Now, some of you who have read about these rituals before are probably familiar with those names, or you've at least heard of them before. Okay, indeed, this Masonic symbolism and its role as a method of implanting memes of helplessness, double-mindedness, and passivity within society must be grasped in its deepest significance at work in all three of America's infamous assassinations of the 1960s, by which he means JFK, Martin Luther King, and then Robert Kennedy. Okay, let's see. You'll find that the after-the-fact revelations are as much a part of the assassination plot as the murder and its initial cover-up. It's a deliberate psychological process they're taking us through, a psychodrama of enormous scale. We structure our activities so that as conspiracy researchers unravel them, they will release information into the public consciousness in such a way that it mirrors our initiatory procedures. So even as researchers uncover this stuff, they are unwittingly helping release these memes into the public consciousness that is intended all along. Now, I would say that doesn't mean we don't research them, but they've anticipated that researchers are going to do this and then slowly release as this stuff is uncovered. And as people start to put these pieces together, they will release these memes into the, collective societal consciousness. Success can then be measured precisely to the extent that our work is exposed. That's the way the cryptocracy, which is the term Michael Hoffman uses, the way in which the cryptocracy or the deep state would look at this. Okay, so back to Farrell. What Hoffman is implying is that the Warren report itself, now remember the investigative commission was called the Warren Commission, which produced, a final report. That's the report that says there was no conspiracy. Lee Harvey Oswald was acted as a lone wolf. So what Hoffman is implying is that the Warren report itself was not just a cover-up. It was a deliberately contrived technique of psychological warfare, a deliberately contrived technique of psychological warfare and alchemical operation and magical working designed to reinforce the power of the hidden elites at work in the assassination itself. And then he quotes Hoffman. 1, the ritual murders are successfully accomplished. The principals get away. The scapegoat conveniently takes the blame. 2, later, we learn the truth, but no one is prosecuted. Imagine that. We are mocked, disoriented, demoralized. Occult prestige and potency are heightened. This is what simplistic researchers miss. The function of macabre arrogance thumbing its nose at us while we do nothing except spread the tale of their immunity and invincibility further. This is the game plan operant here. The alchemical principle of revelation of the method has as its chief component a clown-like grinning mockery of the victim as a show of power and macabre arrogance. While this is performed in a veiled manner, accompanied by certain occult signs and symbolic words, and elicits no meaningful response of opposition or resistance from the targets. It is one of the most efficacious techniques of psychological warfare and mind rape. So he goes on, the ritual sacrifice of the king of Camelot, detailed planning that went into this aspect of the murder. It is an important clue into the nature of yet another possible player or group at the deepest level of the assassination and its cover-up. The killing of the king right. So again, we're looking at President Kennedy as the king in this ritual. Now, remember, they just referred to like the King of Camelot. Remember, um, that was the term that was kind of used to describe the Kennedy administration was Camelot, right? The killing of the king Wright was accomplished at another Trinity site located approximately 10 miles south of the 33rd degree of north parallel latitude between the Trinity River in Dallas and the Triple Underpass at Daley Plaza in Dallas, Texas. All right. So for these occult rituals, the location is important. Okay. So they're talking about it's a Trinity site because it is in vicinity of the Trinity River. And it's also about 10 miles south of the 33rd degree of north parallel latitude. Okay. For those of you who are familiar with the significance of that number. But I'll read that again. The killing of the king Wright was accomplished at another Trinity site located approximately 10 miles south of the 33rd degree of north parallel latitude between the Trinity River in Dallas and the Triple Underpass at Daley Plaza in Dallas, Texas. Daley Plaza was the site of the first Masonic temple in Dallas. In this spot, which had been known during the 19th century cowboy era as Bloody Elm Street, the world leader who had become known as the King of Camelot, President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, was shot to death. A widely publicized image, which has become perhaps the key symbol of the enigma of the Kennedy hoodwink, emerged immediately in the wake of the assassination. A photograph of the three tramps in official custody, who were later unexplainably released and never identified, though speculation about who they really were has reached fever pitch among investigators. The photograph of these three guys, these three tramps, that are in the ritual playing the role of, Jubella, Jubello, and Jubellum. But anyway, so Hoffman goes on here. The photograph is a ritual accompaniment of the black mass that was the ceremonial immolation of a king, the unmistakable calling card of Masonic murder, the appearance of Jubella, Jubello, and Jubellum, the three unworthy craftsmen, okay, in the actual ritual. The assassination is a Masonic riddle several magnitudes above the pedestrian. Okay, so this is not just some run-of-the-mill, plot here. A hidden government behind the visible government of these United States became painfully obvious in a kind of subliminal way and lent an undercurrent of the hallucinogenic to our reality. There was a transfer of power in the collective group mind of the American masses from the public power of the elected frontman, chief executive, to an unelected, invisible college capable of terminating him with impunity. So that was Hoffman. Now Farrell goes on. In other words, Hoffman is saying that in addition to the other groups surveyed in previous chapters with a hand in and motivation and means to commit the crime, there is a deeper player, one with a much more long-term agenda, deeply rooted in ancient history and a legendary path it wants to bring into magical reality. He is saying there's a group that was involved in the planning of the murder with deep and detailed knowledge of ritual magical practice. Okay, so, and then he goes on and he mentions, he mentions the Nazis. There are many people who have said that, holdovers of the Nazis. And if you're familiar with Farrell's work, he'll talk about like the Nazi International. So you had these guys that had been members of the Nazi Party that were still around after World War II. For those of you who are familiar with Operation Paperclip, we brought a lot of those guys here. Some of them went to the UK. A lot of them went to the Soviet Union. Some of them went to South America. So is there some sort of network that sometimes is called the Nazi International, of groups of these like ex-Nazis that are in communication with each other even decades after the end of World War II? If that sounds far-fetched, I mean, okay, but is it? I mean, a bunch of those guys came here. I mean, they built our space program. They, I mean, where do you think our mind control operations came from? Um, we borrowed a lot of the methodologies in the medical practices from those doctors and technical experts that were brought over as part of Paperclip. Soviets did the same thing. Okay, so the point is that you had at a minimum, ex-Nazis that were here that were still in Europe. Some of them had gone to the UK. Some that were in the Soviet Union, and some that were in South America. So again, it's not too far-fetched to think that there was some sort of network of communication between them. But again, let's not get stuck too much on that detail. But Farrell, remember, so the subtitle of his book is A Coalescence of Interest. So he's talking about all these groups that may have had a hand in wanting Kennedy gone. Because you'll hear people talk about, oh, it was the CIA, or oh, it was Cuba, oh, it was the mafia, or the Nazis, or whomever. So who exactly, had the ability to pull it off, wanted to pull it off, etc. Anyway, Farrell goes on. It should not therefore surprise us in the deeper conspiracy of the Warren Commission cover-up. Two of the key people, J. Edgar Hoover, whose FBI led the investigation to frame Oswald, and Chief Justice Earl Warren, were both Freemasons. Hoover was a 33rd degree Mason, one of the most highly ranking Masons in Washington at the time. Earl Warren was founder of the Ars Quattuor Coronati Masonic Lodge, the research and intelligence arm of American Masonry. He goes on, in this in this context, it is perhaps even more significant that there is not only a dark Masonic magical symbolism operating in Dealey Plaza, but also the dark symbolism of the Mauser, then the Mannlicher Carcano rifles attributed to Oswald, pointing fingers to the deeply occulted and occult powers at work. We are confronted by a new set of data, indications of deep Masonic principles at work in the crime and deep Masonic principles at work in the cover-up. And we see the motivations for this involvement, namely the transformation of American social consciousness. Okay, so for those of you who are not aware, the reason that he's mentioning two rifles is because the rifle that is said to have been used in the shooting is an Italian rifle. It's a Mannlicher Carcano. But originally, the initial reports that came out were that the type of rifle that had been used was a German Mauser, but it was a specific model that had not been created in Germany for the German armed forces, but in fact had been created for Argentine forces. Now, some of you will know the connections between, ex-Nazis in Argentina. That's not a secret. Yeah. So the specific model. So the initial reports, the rifle killed or that was used to kill JFK was a specific model of a German Mauser, but it was a specific model that was not used by the German military, but by the Argentine military. Okay. And then shortly thereafter, for whatever reason, the story was changed to this Italian rifle, the Mannlicher Carcano, of a completely different caliber, et cetera. Right. So, by the way, the rifle that supposedly killed Charlie Kirk, for those of you who have listened carefully, is also a Mauser. Completely different model, but it is also a Mauser. Anyway, all right. So, what's the point here? So I just wanted to share with you guys some thoughts on why these events happen, okay? And us looking at, hey, a coup isn't always just a one and done event, though clearly this assassination was one of those like single discrete events that moves us into the next phase of control. I do believe that it was an occult ritual. I think that 9/11 was an occult ritual. I do think the COVID operation had a lot of occult significance. I think that the Charlie Kirk operation, whatever happened there, and I don't pretend to know, but whatever happened there, I do think that it was clearly planned, orchestrated, was well thought out, had a very clear, like kind of post kinetic exploitation phase of the operation. And I do believe that there was a lot of occult symbolism and imagery at play with that event as well. So yeah, I think there is something to be said for looking at the Kennedy assassination as a killing of the king ritual, which is clearly sick. It's, you know, it's sick, it's twisted. But that's who these people are that are carrying out these events. So what does this mean for us? So what does it mean to think that, yeah, but if we try and expose some of this, are we actually playing into their hands? Well, yeah, I mean, I think they expect us to do that, but I still think we should do that. You know, I think we have to know what their plan is. We have to know that that occult imagery is at play, because we have to know that the people that we are dealing with um are operatives of the occult. They are performing what they see as black magic rituals. And I think we got to guard against it. Now, I mean, I'm a believer, and I know that not everyone is, but I am someone who takes, you know, my Christian faith seriously. And some of you out there may feel the same on that, and others maybe you think a little bit differently. But that very much informs my worldview, you know, which I do believe is the correct worldview. I'm not gonna apologize for my beliefs, but I'm not a relativist in this regard. I mean, I do think that it is the correct view. And so I just think the reason that I say that is not to get overly preachy here, but just to say that we are at war with dark forces. You know, when we talk about spiritual warfare is a real thing. And not only that, but it is the war. You know, when we talk about spiritual warfare, that's not a metaphor. That's not to say like, oh, well, we're using the metaphor of war because it kind of helps us understand it. It's not a metaphor. Okay. Spiritual warfare is warfare. It is literal warfare. It just happens to be spiritual, which means it may look a little bit different. It may be carried out a little bit differently than the way in which we tend to think of war. But that's why I'm always saying that we've got to broaden our understanding of war. War is much more than just, you know, guns, tanks, bombs, etc. It's also information. It's perception management. It's but most fundamentally, it is spiritual. And the other ways in which it is manifested just are kind of extensions of the spiritual core of the war. So anyway, I know that you know, what am I saying here is I'm wrapping up. So I'm not telling you like who I think killed JFK, because I do believe that it was um, a, a group of groups probably that came together, but that's kind of what the deep state is. And I do believe it was an occult ritual. And I think it's important that we know that, because the occult rituals have not stopped. They continue to go on. And it's important to understand that we are in this ongoing transfer of power, and that we are being enslaved. With every passing day, we're being further enslaved. And I just want people to understand that, so that we can resist, so that we don't become passive, so that we don't just take these memes that are given to us and assimilate them into our being, and then just remain passive and just accept the lies, even though we know that they're lies, but we just allow our, you know, historical edifice to be built on these lies. So anyway, hey, thanks for hanging in there. Go watch that other video. I will post the link. Go watch that other video if you have not checked that out before, because it may help this make some sense, because it will give you some more context into what I'm saying about either the idea of coups or the deep state. All right, have a good one. Until next time.